Yes.
All right. All right. Good evening, everyone. We're very excited to host our very first talk as the Northeast Collective, and we're grateful to everyone who has shown up to this panel discussion. And we decided to start our series of talks with this topic in particular, gender in the Northeast, because we realized that substantial recognition of the Northeast is often missing when we're discussing gender in India in general. So through this talk, we hope to break the homogenous idea of the Northeast as just this one monolithic entity, and see how gender might, how experiences of gender might vary across different states and communities. So today we have two wonderful panelists, Professor Sorgajoti Gohai and Miss Angela Rangat. And I'll just give a brief introduction of the two panelists today. So starting with Professor Swargajoti Gohai, she's an assistant professor of sociology and anthropology at Ashoka University. She has conducted her doctoral research in Tawang and West Kameng, which are two districts in West Arunachal Pradesh, which have been the focus of long-drawn India-China boundary conflict. Her first book is Imagined Geographies in the Indo-Tibetan Borderlands, which was recently published this year by the Amsterdam University Press. And she has also published several articles on the politics of language, development, state formation, and identity politics among Tibetan Buddhist communities in Arunachal Pradesh. Our second panelist is Miss Angela Rangat, and she is trained in anthropology and law and is one of the founders of the TUR Workers' Power. She has played a seminal role in establishing the Meghalaya Right to Information movement, and she has been involved in the causes and issues that promote the use of RTI to seek accountability. And she's a key member of many progressive movements and campaigns in the state, advocating for and promoting equal rights for dignity and justice to all residents of the state, including the right to work, right to self-determination, right to food, and right to information. So as you can see, our both our panelists have a great amount of experience, and we hope this discussion will be very enriching. And to give a little brief structure of the talk, first we'll have the panelists talk for about 10 to 15 minutes each. And after that, it'll be followed by a quick discussion with me. And then we will open the floor to questions, and you can put those in the chat box, or you can raise your hand and we can take questions there. And if you're watching this from the YouTube live, you can also put questions in the chat box and we will take questions from there. So if you don't mind, Professor Swargajoti Gohain, would you mind going first? And the floor is yours.
Right. Thank you so much, Chani. And I'd like to really congratulate the Northeast Collective for starting this initiative. I know that it's been on the kind of pipeline for some time, and it's really heartening to see it finally come to fruition. And I'm really proud to be part of this first event. So my expertise is not gender studies, but I work on borders and conflict. So thank you for inviting me, and I'm going to speak a little bit on general issues, although the forum's focus is to highlight the internal differences of within the different parts of Northeast India. And we know that Northeast India has become a homogeneous category, kind of a monolithic category. And it's a very good objective of this, of this collective to try and highlight the internal heterogeneity in this region. But I'm going to start with some general issues, and because it's very difficult to pick each state and try to give something or say something representative about each state in 10 minutes. So what I would like to first say is that unlike there's a very kind of a stereotypical notion about women in Northeast India, that they are somehow, relatively better off than other parts of India. Somehow there is more equality, but that's actually a myth, because even in this part of the country, like the other parts of the country, there are patriarchal structures, there are unequal relations. Women face discrimination from male dominated institutions, so they do have to struggle to carve out a space for themselves. So I think there are three levels in which we can understand this kind of vulnerability that is faced by the women in Northeast India. First of all, the first level of vulnerability is because they're women, and women are minorities everywhere, not numerically, but because of their subordinate status in almost every part of the world, they're considered a minority. So that's the first level of marginality of women in Northeast India. The second level is when we talk about conflict, because many parts of Northeast India have seen conflict, whether it is ethnic conflict, ethnic strife, whether it is in terms of resistance to the state, whether it is in terms of border conflict. So many of the borders are in Northeast India are disputed. There are disputes, boundary disputes between India and China, and all these different kinds of conflict have also contributed to the vulnerability of women, because we know that women's bodies often become the battlefield, the kind of the site, the space on which battles over territory, over caste, over class are waged. And in fact, today, as some of you know, there was a class discussion during one of my in one of my classes, where we were discussing the Hathras rape, the rape of the Dalit women. And we were talking about how, often in some narratives, the caste identity of the woman, of the Dalit woman, is sought to be effaced. So, what this is not something that can be effaced, because the caste wars, class wars, territorial battles, they're actually frequently fought by using the sexual bodily domination over women, or by controlling women's right to love and marry, or to control, or by controlling women's reproductive rights. So conflict actually makes the woman's body an even more ravaged battlefield, so to speak. And the third level of vulnerability faced by women in Northeast India is, I think, the border aspect. And we can talk about borders in many ways, and all these different ways apply in the case of the Northeast Indian region. They are cultural borderlands, they are geographical borderlands, they are also racial borderlands. And so violence against women in this part of the country is different because of all these, the intersection of all these different borders. They are the other in multiple senses. And we know how border identities create or make for very ambiguous identities, because people who live in the border are seen to harbor some kind of an ambiguous identity, since they share traits from both sides. And that is the character of borders. Identities are fluid. Whether it is the Bangladesh border, whether it is the Tibetan border, whether it's the Myanmar border, all these, the border creates that kind of ambiguity. And just to give you, which makes the people at the border somehow thought to have some dubious kind of loyalty. So I'm going to recount a small kind of a conversation snippet that emerged during my fieldwork in Tawang, which is in Arunachal Pradesh, and it shares a boundary with China, and it's been the subject of a border dispute for several years. So there was a conversation which took place between a friend, I'll just call her Dolma, and an army officer when I was doing fieldwork. So this army man comes to talk to my friend about a package that he's supposed to collect from her. And Dolma replies that, delivery would be delayed, because that's how deliveries often are delayed to this part. So he says that he would be visiting his hometown in North India for some time. So when the delivery comes, she should hand the package to his deputy. And he says that you should now look at each other's faces very well, so that when the deputy comes to collect the package, she should not have a problem. I mean, there shouldn't be a problem in recognition. So the army man says, of course, you are going to recognize him, but he will find it difficult to identify you. All of you look so similar, Monpa, Nepali, Chinese. Then Donma says, is that so? Well, China keeps calling us, come, come. In that case, we should go to their side. So the army man says, do you wish to go over to their side? Then Donma, she pouts and she says, why not, since you can't differentiate between us? The army man then laughs and he says, don't say such a thing. Is our presence here all in vain? So, it's clear that the army man and my friend, they were clearly, joking, bantering, kind of flirtatious, kind of bantering. But the undercurrent of tension, there was something deeper here, which struck me, and which is why this incident entered my field notes. So this distinction that the army man made from North India, he makes between himself and the Monpas, somehow identifies the Monpas, the people in Tawang, as physiologically similar or closer to non-Indian nationalities. But the retort of my friend is also important because it reveals some kind of a tension between this image of the Monpa women as being uh, as requiring saving, and the image of the North Indian army man as saviors. But compared to other parts of Northeast India where there is militarization, in Tawang and West Kameng, the relations between local people and army are not that, conflicted. In other parts where we see the ASPA in operation and we see so much conflict between military and local population, we see how, conflict actually exacerbates the tension between borderlanders and the mainland, because it means that the figure which is the other within, the internal other is, conflict means that the internal other is refusing incorporation into the national body. So more violent means of state repression has to be used, and women then bear the brunt of this subjugation. And that is why I feel that all these different levels of operate simultaneously in Northeast India, which makes the women here more vulnerable in terms of the conflict situation there. I'm sure there will be other topics and other themes that will crop up, but I will just end here and I will leave it to Chani to continue the conversation.
Thank you so much for that. Right now, we'll move on to Miss Angela Rangan and have her share her thoughts.
Okay, thank you once again to the Northeast Collective at Ashoka University. So glad to meet all of you, and of course, Professor Gohain. Let me first put out a disclaimer, okay? Whenever there's any discussion which has as its broad theme the Northeast, it really frightens me, because I think there's so many assumptions already, that we all know each other so well. Looking at the map, you all are so close. People don't even understand sometimes about how it's quite expensive to get from Shillong to Aizawl, because looking at the map, it looks as if you can just hop across. So they assume that we are actually intermingling so much and we understand each other so much and we know about the other so much, which is not true. So although the broader theme is to look at Northeast and gender in the region, I would like to say that I will not claim to be speaking for the region. And in fact, I will be drawing most of my discussion based on our experience in Meghalaya. But again, there also, there's so much that I still don't understand, for instance, about the Garo Hills. And many of the kinship relationships there, or how their traditional system plays out, is also quite different from the Khasis. Although all the three tribes, the Jaintias, the Khasis, and the Garos, are matrilineal, but how that plays out for these three tribes, and again within those tribes also, there are finer sort of nuances depending on regions from in Meghalaya. So like, for instance, the first thing when people think of Meghalaya is that it's one of the last surviving matrilineal societies in the country and in the world, even some people claim. And internally in the state, we're always told that we have to be very proud of this fact. Although many people still confuse matrilineality as being matriarchal, which is about authority being vested in women, which is not at all true. And at one level, our being matrilineal has, in many senses, also hampered a more vibrant growth, I can say, of a women's movement here. And I will give you examples of that. And there are many deniers that patriarchy exists at all, So we keep trying to stress on the fact that that we are matrilineal in patriarchy, because the overall system is the same as it is for the rest of the country, as it is. Matrilineality means that we trace our lineage from the mother, and if we happen to come from a landed household, a wealthy household, some of the inheritance will pass to the younger daughter. And also that, and this is a point which everyone gets fascinated about and feels very happy, that on marriage, the men usually follow the women if she's the youngest in the household. But the finer nuances of what this matrilineality means, for instance, is it really true that all the youngest daughters inherit, is a big question mark. Like I said, it depends a lot on whether the family is propertied at all. And this whole notion of property even is so new, because according to, caste tradition and customs, what was actually more stressed upon was community-based ownership of things, whether it was rivers or forests. There was an emphasis on the commons. Whereas now it's more trying to look at how property is handed over from individuals to individuals, and not, having common rights to, say, utilize a field or a forest, etc. Then the other stark reality about matrilineal Meghalaya is that we may be matrilineal, and that being so, it is true that you will find more women out on the streets. The question is, are they safe, is still a question which we need to address, because the NFHS survey, for instance, indicated that from all the Northeastern states, domestic violence is highest in Meghalaya. Okay, forget about the other forms of violence. We see that there are often rapes and even sexual harassment and all of that quite rampant. So the other indicators, because people automatically think that if you're from a matrilineal society, you're so much better off. So it is true that you will find more women, they are more visible. But like I said, are they safe is a question which doesn't have, a clear answer to. The thing is, if we are more egalitarian, do we actually share decision-making powers with the men? Again, if you look at our traditional systems, they say customarily we are not supposed to be participating at the grassroots governance structure, which is the darbars. We don't have the Panchayati Raj system. And actually, it is not true that it was tradition that women did not participate, in local level governance. In fact, pre-colonial history shows that there were women sardars or women heading villages, etc. But post-colonial and with the new thing of as we moved along, it was recreated, and there was a different interpretation of what tradition was, and more it became accepted that women actually never participated and therefore should not participate in local governance structures. And it's so ironic because, for instance, recently with the COVID thing, you find that at the ground level, there were more women frontline workers, whether it was your ASHAs or your ANMs who actually had to interact with the village level structures. These were mostly women. And they say that women are not capable of kind of participation. In fact, we have a saying that if the world will end when the which means when the woman crows, the world will come to an end, meaning that women ought to not be seen too much in public discourse and public decision-making, etc. Then again, the other indicators of whether we're really better off than the rest of the country being matrilineal, MMR is one of the highest in the region. We have like 187 deaths per every lakh live births. And this, if you check, is highest in the region. So why is it that if we were so free to make decisions concerning our reproductive health and rights, why is it that we're having such a lot of maternal deaths? So these are some of the questions that are pertinent when we try to constantly sort of pose as this unity that can lead the way and show the way in terms of, gender equality, etc., because we're matrilineal. Then the other thing also, which is shocking, is that we think that all tribal societies are egalitarian. And like I was saying, initially, traditional systems are such that there was an emphasis on, a communitarian way of life and of sharing the commons, etc. But more and more now, with the onslaught of capitalism and all of this, there is an emphasis on private property. There is an encroachment on communal rights to land, etc. And that latest socioeconomic caste census shows that there is such a high level of landlessness in Meghalaya. Now, if you're going to say that Meghalaya, the women inherit all of the land and have land, etc., it is again not true. Then again, I spoke a little about the representation of women at the grassroots level, at the local darbars, that they are not allowed to hold key positions in the executive, or they can never be, for instance, the Gaubura, etc. But even in the formal structures of governance, you will find that at a time, there have always been only, say, 5 women representatives in a house of 60 in our state legislature. Similarly, in the Khasi Hills Autonomous District Council, the Jaintia Hills Autonomous District Council, and the Garo Hills Autonomous District Council. So why is there this kind of ill-balanced representation? Is it not because we women also feel that it is not our place to participate in, in such a public sphere as politics, or there is still this conditioning that all of that, and surely it is also because the larger, way of how political parties operate, they would not give tickets to women and not encourage women to take part in politics. So this is the reality, but I'd also like to take you through 2 very interesting movements that some of us were involved in. And these were to do with the attempts to pass 2 very serious legislations by the Khasi Hills Autonomous District Council, okay? The Khasi Hills Autonomous District Council emerged as a result of the 6th schedule of the Constitution. Their mandate is to look at codification of customary law, to protect our land and forests, etc. Again, big question mark whether this has been done. But in the past few years, their interpretation of customary rights and tradition has been one where they ensure a certain subjugation of women. Okay, they're all very proud and happy that we're matrilineal, although there is also a movement for, I don't know if many of you may know about this. It's called SRT, or Sinkhong Rimpai Thamai. This movement started by men who have been for very long saying that the reason why the Khasis and this state of Meghalaya is so backward and we're not going forward is precisely because we're matrilineal. This whole thing of giving lineage to women and property to women has meant that we are far behind the rest of the country and the world. And hence, look at the Nayars in Kerala. They were once matrilineal, but they realized that changing to a patrilineal system will help them, in the race to development, etc. So this is a group that has also been demanding that we change our system of matrilineality to being a patrilineal society. Okay, so that's happening in the background. And then the KHADC comes up with these two laws, bills, because we protested quite loudly. So they have not seen the light of day yet. So one was this administration bill, which they pushed to try and sort of regulate and reform the traditional governance structures. And we all said, yes, it's very good, because sometimes, you know what happens in these traditional systems, you have a headman for like donkey's years, more than 10, 20 years. There's no election. There's no system of having timelines to finish projects. There's no accountability, no transparency. So it's good if such a bill comes up which tries to reform these structures. But what they also tried to sort of fix, and this is where this whole idea of codification of customary laws becomes dangerous, is because they actually tried to fix the idea that women ought to never be allowed in these traditional structures of governance. And we said, I mean, some of us came together and protested this bill precisely on the fact of them saying that women can never participate. And it was because of this objection and this particular bill, actually it has been now sort of stuck. It never got the etc. So that was one of the things the women were vocal about. In 2018, another very, very controversial, which was the Khasi social custom of lineage bill. And this bill proposed that any Khasi woman who marries a non-Khasi will lose identity, and so also her children, and will therefore not be able to inherit, and all of that. So again, many of us got together and challenged this bill clause by clause, because it was obviously very gender biased, because in the same bill it says that it is not okay for a woman to marry a non-Khasi man, but traditionally, if a Khasi man marries a non-Khasi woman, there has always been the system of tangjat. Tangjat means you create a new clan altogether, because the woman can't give her surname to the children. So they have something called tangjat, where there's a bit of a ceremony and they happily create a new clan, combining the name of the woman and the clan of the Khasi man. So again, we challenged this, this bill, and it was really actually a very sort of tough time for the women here, because by that time, you know, social media is something which was used so effectively to vilify anybody who was questioning this bill, that we were actually these, you know, people who are trying to decimate Khasi tradition and Khasi way of life, and also trying to dilute, pollute, all of those words, Khasi identity. So there was an attempt to control women through these two bills. And this lineage bill, especially in 2018, the kind of vilification that happened through social media was something that's calling for outright violence against anybody who was who had a dissenting voice against this bill. And you know, the loudness of those voices and the sheer volume of the hate which was there during that time, the debates around the bill started sometime in June, July, became so much that it created an atmosphere, just like what is happening in the country right now. You know, there's a certain atmosphere ki it's okay to be hateful and to be violent. So in a similar fashion, there was so much hate being spewed out that in that same year, in November, a very good friend and fellow activist, Kong Agnes Karshiing, who actually has been talking a lot about the illegal extraction of coal, was attacked when she had gone to try and report the NGT violations, of illegal coal extraction. And we really feel that that wasn't an isolated incident. It actually, there was a kind of atmosphere that was built up around the idea that, you silence any woman, especially who hangs dirty linen in public, who dares question the authority of these men who are proposing legislations to regulate this society, etc. So these are some of our experiences, with a very, very patriarchal structure, which is there and which is actually the superstructure over this tiny thing called matrilineality. So I think I should stop here and maybe we can discuss many more things with questions.
All right, thank you so much to the both of you. One thing that I could draw from both of these is kind of this outsider coming in, and I think these outsiders can be different things. For example, democracy as a concept, or even just specifically the military coming in. So I was wondering if we could have a discussion on how the concept of outsider versus insider has really been embodied by these talks on gender, and yeah, um, how can we better frame our questions or our discussions around this this strict insider versus outsider binary? Yeah, if anyone wants to start.
Uh, right. So I think when we talk about the military, there is definitely that binary being seen, being visible here. And the incident that I recounted about the army man coming, and definitely there's this sense of the the internal other definitely here. So I'm I think the idea that, and there have been actually a lot of written work about it, about how the women in Northeast, but not just the women, but the people from Northeast are somehow not given the status of full citizens. So we know that citizenship has different tiers. There is gradation of citizenship in terms of class. Different people don't get access to citizenship benefits, and in the case of the Northeast, it is a lack of what one can say cultural citizenship. So the people of Northeast are citizens definitely of India, but cultural citizenship in the terms of how they are seen in the cultural kind of imagination, right? Imaginary is a word that is used sometimes in social science, kind of the cultural universe of by which one sort of imagines the nation, the national imaginary, the national cultural imaginary. So Northeast Indian, again, I'm generalizing, but if you see this citizenship, it's not a very kind of a the cultural citizenship is something that is missing for the people of Northeast. So we can talk about, again, citizenship can be talked about at different kinds. Some people talk about how certain groups of people, the disprivileged, impoverished, they don't have access to infrastructural citizenship. So citizenship is denied to them because they don't have access to proper water, proper electricity. They don't have access to basic wages. So there are different ways in which people can be denied full citizenship. And I think for the people in Northeast, it is a denial of cultural citizenship, that kind of equality in terms of the culture. So that is what makes the outsider the construct attached to the Northeast, even though they are insiders. So yes, so they're not full citizens in that sense. Although in principle, in theory, in certain benefits, they might be citizens, but morally and culturally, they're not fully accepted. And that keeps playing in the interactions between people from, so-called mainland India, or represented by the military, but it could be also people from, who have been deputed there to do work there. So I mean, there's this incident which I can't remember the exact dates, but it happened in Arunachal Pradesh, where there was an official, high-level official. I can't remember the exact details, but I think it was the governor. So, Mithun, which is the bison, is killed and it is eaten. It is a ritual animal. It is ritually important animal. So that is eaten for nutrition. It is a traditional animal. It's also valued for ritual purposes. Now, the governor saw this slaughtered carcass of the Mithun lying outside his office, and immediately there was a lot of hue and cry about cow slaughter and cow slaughter being banned and all that. There was a lot of hue and cry about this. But the fact is that this is not cow slaughter, because Mithun is definitely a ritually important animal. So when you apply that kind of a lens, right, of the people from Northeast India, again, and I'm sorry I'm generalizing but I'm just talking about how this vision of the Northeasterns as being outsiders plays out at different levels in different contexts. And so this kind of cultural citizenship, because people don't know, there is a lot of ignorance about what is happening there, and it plays out in different levels and context. Yeah.
Yeah, so very interesting question, because I think especially many of you must have seen that the film Akhuni. After that, there was such a lot of discussion about racism against the Northeast, and then there were counter arguments about how we also are so racist, actually. I mean, reverse racism that we exercise and, are used to. So my comment on this, this whole othering and the idea of the other, I think that at one level, we can be justified in feeling insecure. Even if you look at, for instance, the constitutional debates, when our constitution was being framed, and you read those debates, it's so shocking about the commentary about who these people in this beyond the chicken neck are. And they really had to fight to even have their voices heard, the voices heard in terms of how they do have certain peculiarities which may not necessarily be addressed by a broad brushing of what the rest of India aspires to and what the constitution then should guarantee, etc., which was how, I guess, we got our 5th and 6th schedules and all of that. Now, having said that, I think that while we need to be proud of our, uniqueness, everybody at that level is unique in the entire country. And but we have to actually turn this question inside, in the sense that for decades and decades, we have always blamed the other for our backwardness. For instance, in Meghalaya, underdevelopment is blamed on the Dakhar, that, oh, they come and they take away the jobs and they do this and that, which is, again, is not true, because we have the, provisions in place about reservations, etc. But again, it is also true that sometimes there are, for instance, central government agencies that almost try not to employ locals, reasons best known to them. And this I'm saying because we work with a lot of unions, the security guards, etc., who for years were not even given central government pay, although they were working, say, in central government institutes like NEHU, etc. But again, this whole idea of othering has become an excuse for us. Like, for instance, in Meghalaya, this loud demand of the ILP, inner line permit, by the students' movement is actually an extension of the students' movement at that level, wanting to always put all their problems on the other, not turning the lens on ourselves as a community. The students unions have been the ones who actually have tried to control, for instance, women's everything from who they date to how they dress and all of that. And this is just again an extension of their fear, you know, that it's the outsider who'll come and plunder the women, plunder the wealth, when actually it is time we start talking about what is happening internally in terms of plundering, etc., by local tribal elites. We need to talk about these internal contradictions and the internal class formations that have ensured that 80% of women in the state do not own land. They do not even own homestead, you know? And we need to talk about how it's so convenient to say that our resources are being plundered when actually it is us who have permitted for coal mining, for cement factories to come up, you know, almost 8 to 10 cement factories in a 5-kilometer square radius in Giant Hills. It's just ridiculous. So, and if you look at who are making those decisions or who are the fronts of this exploitation, it's not the women, it's again the men in the society who are actually at that level sold us out. So for instance, the other thing of uranium mining in Meghalaya. It's true that the KSU has been in the forefront of trying to stop it and all of that. But in the end, it was actually that lone woman, that tracts and tracts of land on which they wanted to mine in Domyasiat, who actually stopped the mining because she refused to sell her land at any price named by UCIL, because she saw that her, you know, with the exploratory mining, her cattle had died and some of her daughters became barren and all of that. And this lady now is very, very old. And we fear that when she passes away, much of the resolve against uranium mining may pass away with her, you know, because actually she's the one who's been, in reality, stopping the possibility of mining. And then there are voices within the community who say that we ought to oppose uranium mining because it's being done by the Indian state. It is the outsiders who will come, the workforce will be outsiders. But if we are going to do it ourselves, maybe it's a good thing. Maybe we can earn resources, it seems, for the state. Some have even proposed that maybe we, rather than just giving out uranium for power plants, nuclear power plants or whatever outside, it's better to have a power plant here itself. You know, so these are some of the internal contradictions, etc., which depends on where you are at that moment. This card of the outsider becomes really useful. And then again, this whole thing of outsider is also played out within, at least for Meghalaya, within this other framework of religion. So I'll tell you a personal story. Like when I was getting married to Tarun, he's from Bihar. He's not a Christian. So in the family circles, it was like, it's okay that he's not Khasi, but maybe if he was Christian, it would have been nicer. Okay. And then there was a funny incident which happened where this friend was trying to figure out where Tarun is from. So she says, where are you from? Are you South Indian? He says, no, keep guessing. So then she says, are you North Indian? He says, no. Are you Bengali? No. Assamese? No. He says, you can't guess. She said, no, I'm Bihari, he says. And this girl says, oh no. I mean, that itself revealed that we have these hierarchies, even of the outsider. You know, Indian, because they usually come in the garb of a priest, you know, many Catholic priests and people who are South Indians, these pastors and preachers are from South India, and a Bihari, you know. Then similarly, like Bengali, scholarly, etc. So even in terms of who is a more acceptable outsider, it's a hierarchy we have to go through. And this was shocking because, I mean, now with the CAA debate and all that, it's jarring. But the first time when the Modi government came to be elected, during those elections, it was so difficult for us to even try and have this conversation of what it means to have a right-wing government, the BJP. That was during their first term before they got elected. Because most of the pressure groups here, the students' unions, etc., was saying, actually, the Congress government has failed so miserably. We ought to be giving a chance to Modi because we can be sure that Modi will complete the border fencing with Bangladesh. There is this, like, Islamophobia is there everywhere, sadly, and it is very, very pronounced even in Meghalaya. So they weren't fearful about the BJP's stand on Christianity, Yevo, as long as we could keep away this Bangladeshi Muslim, you know. So those are some of the sort of, what to say, contradictions and the uh, kind of thing we have to negotiate with. Then now with ILP, they're talking about stopping Indians from coming for too long here by issuing a permit, etc. And our question to people who are demanding this, we say it's fine. The ILP will ensure that you regulate movement of people. But what happens about movement of big capital? So these pressure groups, these students' movements, these at that level vanguards of our society, they don't care whether big capital is non-tribal, because as long as they can share in that loot, you know. So some of these are some of the questions which are very uncomfortable, and I think which is so important for us in the region to talk about.
Can I just make one small comment here? Um, So growing up in Assam, I grew up in Assam. So I did notice this, and it's also been commented by many. The rigid boundaries, religious boundaries between Hindu, Muslim, Christian. There were Assamese Hindus, there were Assamese Muslims, and there were Assamese Christians. And although there were boundaries between just the different groups, as boundaries exist everywhere between ethnic groups, between religious groups, between linguistic groups, there were all these boundaries, definitely, and there were also injunctions on marriage and relations. But the kind of phobia which we call Islamophobia now, I did not see it in that pronounced fashion uh, while growing up in the 1980s and 90s even, and it's become even more pronounced now, and that has to do with, of course, the whole ideological changes that the entire country seems to be going through, which has been promoted by educational institutions, by various grassroots organizations. So I think it's this, the whole debate about NRC, and I don't want to divert this entire conversation to NRC and CA, but this whole debate was about, like you pointed out, about the Bangladeshi as the non-citizen rather than the Muslim as the other. So it was the non-citizen versus non-citizen debate, which was more pronounced, at least in Assam. But again, since we're talking about the regional differences among Northeast India, there are bound to be differences also in how people across this region are responding to CA and NRC. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Do you want to say something, Ms. Emma?
I mean, I just wanted to, my analysis of, at least, in Meghalaya, this whole fear of the Bangladeshi has to do a lot with, I think, also this idea that they are predominantly Muslim, etc. And I think this stems, it's true that the larger climate in the country has also shaped that. But much before that, I think that it was at that level a contribution of religion. In Meghalaya, we are predominantly Christians. And there is somehow this, again, the Christians have a hierarchical notion of who are the better religious other. And sadly, those following Islam seem to really scare the hell out of them. I don't know. And so I think that, in the region, there is also a mad this sort of obsession with Christianity in many of the, for instance, Nagaland, Mizoram, Meghalaya. I think much of our worldview or our responses are so much influenced by the church. And that is one thing we have to look out for.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think this conversation could go on, and I'm learning so much from just this discussion. But I think now we'll turn to questions, and if anyone has any questions and would like to speak up, please let us know, or you can put them in the chat box. We have a few questions from the YouTube live as well, so I'll just read one of those out first. And so this one is for Professor Swargajoti. If you could just give a little bit of a background on what cultural citizenship means for people who might not be familiar with it, and what might some examples of that be?
This is a concept that I've been teaching in class, and so it sprang to my mind. But cultural citizenship is a concept that is more inclusive in the sense that citizenship, in theory, in principle, it is supposed to be equal rights and opportunities for all in exchange for certain obligations and duties that citizens perform to the state. Now, what happens in practice is that citizenship benefits are not actually equally distributed, and people do get left out. Certain people get left out in terms of their access to infrastructure and education because of poverty. Some people get left out because of some other, disprivileges. And my theory here is that in people in Northeast India get left out because of cultural factors, and hence they don't have full access to cultural citizenship. So although there are citizenship also can be then broken down or disaggregated into different kinds, different aspects. If you look at infrastructure, culture, and law, you'll see that in women, of course, are then second-class citizens in that sense, because they do not have equal access to although institutionally they do not have equal access, so they are also then second-class citizens. So how do you make citizenship equal in all these different respects, culturally, infrastructurally, in terms of law? So how do you make citizenship a very holistic kind of practice on the ground? And in relation to the Northeast, I feel that it is the aspect of cultural citizenship. Of course, infrastructure also has to be addressed. Development is always a perennial question there. Do you have development? If you have development, and I think Angela, if I may, has worked on this about how development is not development for the communities there. So how do you have development for communities there? So there are different ways in which you can approach the idea of citizenship. But I think cultural citizenship is something that really needs to be addressed in relation to the Northeast. I have to stop referring to the Northeast because I seem to be taking away from the aims of this collective, which is the regional diversity.
Thank you so much. I think there are a few people here who wanted to ask. Siddharth, if you don't mind.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much to the panelists. I think I learned so much from your talk today. My question specifically was kind of based on your, the concept of the insider, outsider concept that you were talking about, right? So I've always been interested in the Northeast and understanding how conflict works there and things like citizenship and stuff like that. But whenever I turn towards resources, I find a lot of it being written by people who may not directly have a stake or have an outsider's perspective, and it's been kind of hard for me to find authentic sources. So I was wondering if you had any specific books or films that I could use as reference to understand it better, but from a local point of view.
I'm just going to answer briefly and then I'll hand it over to Angela. Representation, how do you representation and what is an authentic representation? So the film Akuni that Angela mentioned was made by a local, from a person from there, but he met with a lot of criticism that he was not being representative enough. So I'm not sure whether you can say that even an insider perspective, it can be wholly representative. And definitely, the question of representation is very important. I'm just going to stop here.
I think what Professor Gohain said is true, that, uh, it boils down to the question of who is indigenous enough. And even if you're indigenous enough, can you holistically represent yourself and your community? I don't think so. Because first of all, for instance, a woman representing Khasi society will have a very different thing of what she has to say, and her experience of being a Khasi is very different from that of a Khasi male. That's one thing. But again, our location in terms of class is so, and so how we experience, for instance, racism against the Northeast, or our relationship vis-a-vis the larger Indian state, our ability to identify with the movements for autonomy in the region, who are from, actually find these struggles as such a waste of time. They don't see the point to the idea of autonomy, or to even engage in the question of why are people wanting autonomy, or what does it mean? Was there really a betrayal when the Indian state was set up? So, no, they cannot be a kind of a Shuddh representation, so to say. But there is quite a bit of literature which looks at the contradictions and is more an honest account, let's say. It's not a holistic full picture, but it's a more honest account of life in the region, of the conflict uh, in various states. Like, for instance, Pradeep has this book on Manipur, which is really eye-opening. Then for us in Meghalaya, many of the books have been written actually by non-local scholars. So there's this Bengt Carlson book that is really useful when you want to understand political economy and resources in Meghalaya, So I think there are some accounts there that are more honest, and the insider view is not necessarily also the best view.
Thank you for that. I'll go with a question from YouTube for now. I think this one is more to Professor Sorgajyoti. Why is it that in Assam, the role of women on ground level socio-political mobilization is very visible, yet women hardly ever get visibility in the higher rung of representation?
So this is, again, not just common to Northeast India, but common to so many other places in the world, where there might be institutional provisions for women to participate in, um, positions in decision making, but that is the formal apparatus, right? So we have, for example, we have Ayesha Jalal, who talks about formal democracy and substantive democracy, and formal is the formal appearance and the routine kind of rules and regulations, but then what is substantive, what is qualitative? So why don't that quality, why doesn't that qualitative change happen? And the factors also have to do with economic independence. It has to do with the disproportionate, division of housework, childcare. Everything has to be borne by women. Property, and again, cultural norms. So again, there have been studies about women in panchayat in Assam, and how women in panchayat may be represented because of the 33% reservation, but the same factors which inhibit women from actually participating, they may be formally there as figureheads. And I was watching this, very good episode, series, kind of a Amazon Prime series called Panchayat, where there's this figure, there's a character of a woman panchayat leader, but she is just a figurehead. I mean, the actual practice, actual governance is done by her husband. So the husbands, brothers, male cousins, they're the proxy leaders. And it's also the same in Assam. It's the husband, it's the, and also many parts of Arunachal Pradesh where I did, field work. So this is the reality, which the qualitative and substantive aspects are not changing.
All right. I think Daya had a question. Yeah.
Good afternoon, good evening, panelists. I'm Dayatra, and I'm Assamese by birth, and I've often faced this criticism in places that I go for various stuff of, oh, you come from Assam, or oh, you come from Northeast. There are schools there. People look at me and turn, and Northeast is in India. We have this weird questionings, and it's sad, and it's often and it feels like we are responsible for not having Northeast recognized as much as it should be. So I think as I mean, what can we do on our level, or on even on how we portray ourselves, or how we talk about how we represent Northeast? What can we do on our level to have it recognized as much, and have our culture and have our abilities be showcased as much as the rest of India?
Okay, so let me ask a question. Why are we obsessed about being showcased? I mean, like when we were struggling with issues here, sometimes people keep saying, oh, national press doesn't give us enough attention because we don't command the numbers in parliament, or we don't command that kind of clout and all that. And we used to suffer from this identity crisis, so to say. But as we went along in our work, we suddenly realized that we should start even the way we frame how we look at things, that we're not being given attention or whatever. We started saying that we are not far away from Delhi. We are not, it is Delhi that is far away from us. Okay. And we started focusing internally, like in our work, I'm just sharing that, supposing a struggle, for instance, on violence against women, why should national media cover a rape story in Meghalaya, for instance? Is if we keep getting obsessed about needing that kind of attention, I think we will lose of what we can do internally. I'm not saying that we have to fully isolate and be indifferent to the world, but we should be able to control the narrative, So, like, we were very upset when that Nirbhaya case happened. Do you remember? So then it became trial by media, and that was the first time everybody lighting candles in India Gate. And I think this 24-hour TV channels had just sort of started that kind of coverage so constantly, and people were just wanting to be part of that bandwagon, wanting to be covered by media. And so here also in Shillong, suddenly we found these localities organizing candlelight vigils and all. And some of us in the women's movement were really ticked off, because not that we should not lend support to a larger national, demand and call for justice and all, but these same women, these same groups do nothing internally when there's a case of rape or something. And it was so ironic, because the same time when that case happened in Delhi, there was this woman in Garo Hills in front of her grandchildren, etc., by the militants. And nobody said a word. So sometimes it's so skewed, our idea of wanting to sort of graft identity for ourselves based on our perception of how the others see us. And then all of our struggles get consumed by that. And so I think that it's important for us in the region to sort of forge ahead with some of the things we do. And it is by sort of having a certain level of snootiness about what we do that perhaps there will be interest by others. Not that we want to be covered by national media or we want to be known just for being known's sake, because that at that level is handing over control also to an entity you feel is larger than the agree with.
Thank you, Professor.
All right, we'll go to the next question. I think Kaisera had a question.
Yes, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for all the information and experiences you've supplied through the discussion. I was actually curious about the concept of reverse racism because I recently read an article which called it a myth, which basically said that it is a form of victimhood. And I was curious about how that plays out on ground, but also in theory, the concept of reverse racism.
This idea, that we, the people of Northeast, are also racist because in all of our communities, we actually have a name for the Indian mainlander. I think in Manipur, you call them Mayangs. In here, we call anybody who's not a tribal a Dakhar. And many people, for instance, who have been residents in Meghalaya, and you know that in Meghalaya, we've had 2 bouts of communal tensions. Once was in 79 between the locals and the Bengalis, then again in 87 between the Nepalis and the Khasis. And then, of course, very recently, a few years ago, between the Punjabis living in this place called Punjabi Line in Shillong and us, the so-called true local, state exists. Many times people of these communities accuse us that we have never attempted to look at, rights of residence or citizenship times longer than I have. The fact that they don't belong to the Khasi, Jaintia, Garo tribe. And for us, it has been very important to open the discourse on this, not in the terms which have been laid out or the framing, for instance, which some of these pressure groups and students-led groups call genuine non-tribals. We don't know who these genuine non-tribals are, but they keep trying to justify their othering, and they're trying to prevent this so-called overwhelming population of the other by saying that we will only allow those genuine non-tribal, meaning that they look at a cutoff date or whatever, people whose families have been here from so and so date, etc. And sometimes in discussion with friends from these communities, some of them feel that they have really been handed, a bad deal when it comes to their rights here in this state. And to some extent it's true, but to some extent, some others feel that it's also what you say, a sense of victimhood. Because, for instance, I talked about the Bengali conflict and the Nepali conflict. When the Bengali conflict happened in 1979, there was at that level some amount of out-migration by the Bengalis. They didn't stay and they didn't sort of try to fight out this battle, you know. They didn't engage with the local on this. And many of them were privileged enough because they were people having government jobs, etc. So they left. And sometimes the kind of tension or the violence was also exaggerated to show. And the example that people always love to reach out to is this whole Kashmiri Pandits and the Muslims in Kashmir and how they were driven out and all. So similarly, sometimes these communities like to talk in terms of that kind of scale, which is not true statistically. Then if you compare it with the 1987 conflict with the Nepalis, they stood their ground and fought, and the locals had to back off. And I think that in any contestation of this kind, over space, over who is more local than who, it is important for engagement, whether it is an engagement in terms of words or even at that level, street fighting. And so many of the Nepalis stayed, and there has never at that level, and there is also a sort of, when you compare, for instance, the Bengali community and the Nepali community here in Meghalaya, at least, the Nepali community, very interestingly, not assimilate, but they engage and they learn the language and they do all of those things. And they are not interested in being portrayed as victims, you know? So there's really such a gray area of what really is reverse racism and who does it serve at what, in which context. And we have to be careful of not overplaying that card to downplay the reality of really what this nation state, especially in this present context, aspires to become, you know, this monolithic Hindu nation or whatever. So they're concepts which I think we have to be open to, but also not allow one to overplay the other.
Right. I'd also like to add that immigration has been part of this nation, this entire region's politics, and different states and different parts have seen anti-immigration politics at different kinds. So Meghalaya, Arunachal Pradesh, Assam, all of these areas have seen this kind of anti-immigration sentiment kind of boiling over, leading to forced eviction of people seen as outsiders, immigrants. But I'd also like to point out that this whole idea of immigration is very difficult, especially so in Northeast India, where there have been different waves. I mean, it applies for the whole of India, but especially true of Northeast India. Because there have been so many waves of immigration, and so who is immigrant, who's a native, is a very troubled kind of question. And so the whole also we keep referring to uh, the people in different parts of Northeast India as tribals, but again, tribal is also a very contested term. Are tribals indigenous to India? Because if you are talking about immigration, then that there must be somebody who's indigenous, posited against the immigrant. So immigrant must suppose that there is somebody called indigenous. But is there something called indigenous in Northeast India? Who's indigenous? And that's why, in Ben Carson that Angela mentioned, he talks about how indigenous identity is also as assumed identity. Who came first? It isn't about who came first. Actually, it's about who came before somebody else. So this relative thing, I came before you. You cannot say I came first, because who came first is a very troubled question. But I came before you. And often this I came before you has become the basis for atrocities against those who came later. So this kind of relative, coming versus those who came later, that has often formed the politics of the region. And the people called outsiders by various labels have borne the brunt of such discrimination. And often it might be overlaid with racism, but I think rather than racism, it is about immigration that we should be actually I think seeing, or this is the lens that we should be adopting in order to understand the ethnic kind of politics in various parts.
Thank you so much. I think we'll end the questions here. And thank you so much to both the panelists once again for attending this and giving this whole talk series to such a good start. And we wanted to say we're so grateful for your presence and the insights you've brought this evening. And we've had a very deep and nuanced discussion and topics that extend far beyond just gender. And I think this goes to show how complex the social relations are in various parts of the Northeast. And I think we also see how a lot of these identities intersect as well, which has been very interesting to learn about. And I think the audience as well has learned a lot. And we also have a few viewers on YouTube who have also, I think, learned a lot from this. And to everyone else, thank you so much for showing up and spending your time with us this evening. We're hoping to have more talks like these in the future. So do stay tuned for more events coming up. And yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for being here.
Thank you. I'd like to personally thank Chani, and I know some of the members. If I leave out somebody, please do let me. Esther, Aditya, and Biplab, and Uttamasha, and did I leave somebody out?
Negulin.
Huh?
Gun.
Negulin, yes.
Gun.
Yeah. So thank you, all of you, for starting this initiative. And thank you so much for such a great start. It was also a pleasure to meet Angela through this platform. I've heard about her activism. So this is a great chance to meet you.
Thank you. Thank you again to everyone. It was interesting to chat, and hopefully we can meet again in the future sometime.
Yeah, thank you. Have a nice evening.
Yeah, you too.
Thank you. Have a nice evening.